The information in this broadcast is for educational purposes only and is not provided as a professional service, medical advice, or is it intended or implied to be a substitute for diagnosis or treatment. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained from this broadcast with other sources and review all information regarding any medical condition or treatment with your physician and other appropriate healthcare providers.
Hi, I'm Pete Levine. Welcome to Noggins and Neurons, Stroke and TBI Recovery, Simplified. I'm a clinical instructor and clinical researcher. I've co-authored dozens of scientific journal articles about brain injury recovery, and I'm also the author of the book, Stronger After Stroke.
I'm Deborah Battistella, occupational therapist, creator of the OT's Guide to Mirror Therapy, and an OT educator. I have a lot of experience working with survivors. Most of my clinical practice has been in a certified stroke center. Pete and I are especially interested in talking about what rehab, neuroscience, and clinical research all have to say about the brain and recovery. But don't worry, our job is to make this stuff simple.
We're here to make it so that everyone, clinicians, clinical students, caregivers, and most importantly, the survivor, understands what it takes to leverage their great neuroplastic brain for recovery.
When I first got involved in clinical research, I remember there was a statistic that the lag time between bench and bedside in rehabilitation was 15 to 20 years. And the idea was that in oncology, you couldn't have that lag time because people die of cancer, whereas typically nobody dies of bad therapy. Do you think that the translation is still that long? What would you estimate or is it impossible to estimate? It depends on the therapist, kind of a deal.
It depends on the treatment, and it depends on the kind of support the treatment's got. A lot of it's cultural as well. But I would say that 15 to 20 years, from moving it from the research into regular clinical practice would be considered to be a very early adoption. That would be considered to be rapid. It's more than 15 to 20 years. In some cases, I think it's a couple generations. When we sit down with our therapists and ask them, do you use the adjunct therapies? The answer is usually not a lot. And why? Well, there's a number of reasons. Timing, but it's just like, it's not part of the culture. Like, it's just not part of the culture, and you ask them, would you like to do it? And of course we would. I mean, why wouldn't we? Right? I wouldn't mind trying something new or trying this new technology or this new treatment, but I don't know where to start. It's not what we've traditionally done. It's not what we tend to do. I'm busy enough as it is. And so these treatments don't get incorporated or added. So, the reasons are legit and they're fine. But I mean, if we're looking at ways that we might be able to further improve recovery and the next big step, because, one of the things that you get a feeling in stroke rehab is people just not quite sure where we're going to go next. It strikes me that this is a lost opportunity that we could take advantage of.
We have two great guests today on Noggins and Neurons, both from the exemplary evidence-based review of stroke rehabilitation, and they do much more than that, as they'll outline. First, Dr. Robert Teasel Md. He is a doctor of PM&R, physical medicine and rehabilitation, and he graduated from the University of Ottawa. He was a consultant physiatrist at University Hospital in London, Ontario from 1986 to 2002, and a consultant physiatrist from 2002 till this present day at Parkwood Hospital, St. Joseph's Healthcare, London, Ontario. He is now concurrently the research director of the Department of PM&R at both Western University and Parkwood Institute. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including two in 2018, the Lawson Impact Scientist of the Year Award and the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine / National Stroke Association Award for Excellence in Post-Acute Stroke. He's authored, unbelievably, 350 peer-reviewed journal articles, 22 book chapters, 60 monographs, that's a detailed written study of a single specialized subject, 345 published abstracts, and 1,600 posters and presentations. He's developed a successful research team and has supervised many graduate students, including 3 Veneer scholars, and those are people in this case, pursuing an MD and a PhD. In 2001 or so, he created the Evidence-Based Review of Stroke Rehabilitation, the EBR-SR, which we keep raving about, an annually updated review of the literature and subsequent evidence for stroke rehabilitation interventions and practices. Although you'll note in the interview that they're going to go biannually because they have a lot of other things they need to do. The EBR-SR is now in its 19th edition. Using this idea, he helped create similar annual reviews for brain injury, that's called the ERB-AI, and spinal cord injury, the SEI-RE.
We are also joined by Marcus Sakely, who is currently the project coordinator for the EBR-SR. Marcus obtained his undergraduate degree in neuroscience at Western University. He previously worked with Dr. Jorn Didrikson in the motor control laboratory at Western's Brain and Mind Institute before moving to the core group at Parkwood.
Okay, Deb and I would like to extend a warm Noggins and Neurons welcome to Dr. Robert Teasel and Mr. Marcus Sakely. Thanks so much for carving out some time for us this evening.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. No better way to spend a Friday night.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think in the last episode that we did, I suggested that we spend so much time talking about the EBR-SR that if we ever change the name of our podcast, we should change it to the Evidence-Based Review of Stroke Rehabilitation Podcast. Maybe we will if we wouldn't get sued. But we've at least mentioned the EBR-SR and or the Evidence-Based Review of Moderate to Severe Acquired Brain Injury, which I still call the ABI EBR, and or Stroke Engine in just about every episode that we've had, except maybe the first couple. And we did 2 episodes called What Works 1 and What Works 2, where we based everything on what appeared to do well in the EBR-SR. We have 2 other episodes on what doesn't work, also based on what looked like it didn't work too well in the EBR-SR. Yeah, you see a trend here? Yeah.
The trend I'm seeing is I should ask for money for this whole podcast. That's what I'm saying.
You know what? Half the episodes, like I mentioned that to Deb. Yeah, we owe him some money. We also have an episode and a half. This makes it even worse. I'm going to owe more to you guys on Stroke Engine. The 4 of us had a quick chat a couple of weeks ago, and Doc, you talked about the long arc of the story of the EBR-SR. Would you mind talking about the early days of the Evidence-Based Review of Stroke Rehabilitation, its genesis, and how it got from there to here?
Yeah, it actually has a really odd beginning, and I think it just speaks to how things just kind of happen and you don't expect it, and certainly wasn't planned in any way, shape, or form. It's not the direction we had thought we were going to, or I thought I was going to go. It actually started back in 1998 with the Ontario government at that time had proposed legislation to, and I was interested in chronic pain and chronic pain research at the time, to stop paying for chronic pain disability. The idea that if they stopped paying for it, it would disappear. So there was a hue and cry, and those of us who are interested in it academically actually did presentations to our provincial parliamentary committees, and they came to the conclusion they might be wrong. And so they actually formed a group to do a large evidence-based review of chronic pain to look at what treatments might be helpful. And in fact, whether chronic pain and disability, there was evidence for chronic pain actually causing true disability. And it wasn't just funded by secondary gain and the fact that they can make money out of it. And so I spent a lot of time with a group of 8 people, and 2 of them were PhD epidemiologists. And we eventually produced this report that ended up being published as a supplement in one of the pain journals on the evidence base for chronic pain disability. And it actually changed the legislation. The government backed off the legislation based on that report. And I was able to actually witness how evidence can actually change policy. So it was really an eye-opener for me that, it was the first time I actually saw research truly applied, particularly at a policy level. So that, I was doing a lot of stroke rehab at the time, a lot of stroke rehab research, but it didn't occur to me that I would do anything like this in stroke rehab until the Ontario government and the Heart and Stroke Foundation put together a Ontario, and Ontario is our largest province. It's now 15 million people in Canada. And, it has, as you know, healthcare, we have social healthcare, and it's basically run by the provinces, not run by the feds. And so the province of Ontario wanted to do this big stroke strategy. and provincial stroke strategy, and asked if I'd be on a committee making recommendations with regard to stroke rehab. And, this was back in 1990, back in 2000 when we were doing this. This was a big deal. And when people would ask what kind of evidence exists for stroke rehab, people would say, well, I can't think of more than 4 or 5 RCTs, and there really isn't much of an evidence base. And it's really remarkable how much things have changed. And so we had an interdisciplinary group that had to come up with recommendations, and my goodness, they couldn't, right? They fought over everything. And, this therapist thought that this therapy should be more important and that this treatment worked better than that treatment, and, yada, yada, yada. So I said, we don't seem to be getting anywhere. Why don't I go back and try and duplicate what we did with the chronic pain? And I sat in my kitchen table for 2 months, and I already done a fair number of reviews in stroke rehab anyways. And I came up with something that's kind of a very crude version of what currently exists in the SREBR. And I brought it back to the committee, and the committee thought it was super cool because we had all these studies that showed what worked and what didn't work, or at least appeared to. And the committee was then able to come up with a number of recommendations. It was quite successful, actually, and had a lot of influence on the province. And we could argue it was evidence-based because, believe it or not, that was the standard back then. And one of the recommendations was that they really liked the idea so much that they decided in 2001 to fund a formal review of the stroke rehab literature. And that's how the rehab evidence-based review got started. Back in 2001, we put together our first edition, which went out in 2002, and it took us a full year to do it. And that was the first EBRSR. I can tell you that one at that time had 400 randomized controlled trials in it. And that at the time was a real epiphany for a lot of people, was that much evidence actually existed. There was probably, I would say, a handful of people around the world that kind of had an understanding that was how much literature existed. Most people had no idea. Most people just assumed there was very little of a strong evidence basis for stroke rehab. Remember, they were doing a lot of bull bath back then, right? Like that was the standard for most of the stuff we were doing. And so, I would often go to lectures and I'd say to people, how many RCTs do you think there are in stroke rehab? And, people would say 2, 5, 10. The occasional enlightened person might say 20. And then I'd say there's 400. And everybody would be just shocked, right? And they go, wow. Even the neurologists in particular would go, wow, you guys really have a good, strong evidence base. You guys should use that, start to developing more evidence-based practice. And so since then, every year we've renewed the EBSR. We're now into our 19th edition, and we're looking at over 3,000 randomized controlled trials.
Wow, exponential.
Well, you have to understand that, we started this thing and it was really successful because it was really starting to influence a lot of guidelines, and a lot of people were starting to refer to it. And, even researchers were referring to it before they started their projects. So it was becoming fairly popular. And in 2004, I was approached by the spinal cord groups down here, the Rickhanson in particular, and we ended up putting one together for brain injury and for spinal cord. So we also have those too. But stroke, is the monster. Stroke has over 3,000 randomized, stroke rehab has over 3,000 randomized controlled trials, which is double brain injury, spinal cord, and MS combined. So the unique thing about stroke rehab is it has more evidence by far than any other area of neurorehabilitation. It is always the leader, always the one where the most studies have been done, always the one that has the most evidence attached to it. So we've always been at this huge advantage with the EBSR compared to the other ones, in that we've always had this incredibly rich database. I mean, we're talking 3,000 randomized controlled trials of largely therapies, some of the secondary complications and some of the psychosocial stuff, but 2/3 of that is motor rehab. 2/3 of those 3,000 randomized controlled trials, and it's growing at the rate of 200 randomized controlled trials a year. So that's kind of a summary of the EBSR. We continue to be funded by the Canadian Partnership for Stroke Recovery, which is attached to the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada. So they've been fantastic. They fund us every year and have for the past basically 20 years, along with the Canadian Stroke Network when it was around. But, the challenge is we still, for the amount of data we have to go through every year, we are chronically underfunded, unfortunately. So there's so many more things we could do if we had some additional resources. But we've been really fortunate to get resources every year. That doesn't happen very often. So we've been really lucky that way. And we're grateful for all the help we get. And it's that consistency that I think has really helped us as well. The fact that we get funded every year and we're able to continually renew the EBSR and keep it up to date. Because so many of these things, as you know, people put them together and then 5 to 6 years later, they're out of date. And we've been able to maintain it on a yearly basis.
That's what I always loved about it. It's a meta-analysis, but it's rolling. So I can, you see meta-analyses 2 or 3 years later, you're not sure whether all that information is up to date enough to present it to clinicians. But you guys update this pretty much every year, right?
We're starting to run into problems, and maybe I'll let Marcus address this to some extent, but we're just so much stuff we have to deal with. There's so much material now that we're probably going to doing it on a 2-year cycle.
Mm-hmm. And that's because there's such an increase of randomized controlled trials?
You want to talk about that, Marcus?
Yeah. I think like Bob said, part of the problem is, it's a good problem to have, but part of the problem is the amount of literature that's coming out on a yearly basis and the manpower that's required really to sort through it all, check it all, extract it all, and then incorporate that into this document. It's certainly become trickier to do, properly. And so a 2-year basis makes it a little easier on our end, at least to make sure that we're getting everything and we're incorporating it in an efficient way, as opposed to maybe, missing studies.
And maybe, Marcus, you could speak to how the expectations of reviews have changed. That people expect a higher standard now than they did 10 years ago.
That's very true. Yeah.
We have to adapt to that and pivot with that.
I think with the PRISMA guidelines that have come out, those are now pretty much a standard across any sort of peer-reviewed publication. As far as publishing your data, you need to follow these particular guidelines, which are, of course, a benefit to the quality of the work. But
what are those guidelines? Would you mind reviewing those?
Sure. Yeah. Essentially, what it is a set of reporting guidelines and then subsequent methodology for creating these systematic reviews. And it usually involves the fact that you need 2 independent reviewers, right, to go through and screen the articles, the title and abstract. You would then screen the full text. And then again, 2 independent reviewers to verify that the data is correct. You'd have a third doing a consensus on any discrepancies between that data extraction. And the method in which you report that data is important as well. So that's not your job though, right? You compile it and then you give it off to these separate reviewers who can kind of take an unbiased perspective. Yes. Yeah. The EBRSR itself isn't necessarily following PRISMA guidelines. We don't have to do that as we're not a peer-reviewed publication. But I think for the purposes of using that data, and other researchers even using that data, we're trying to move in that direction where we will now be doing the lit searches, performing the various extraction methods in a way that follows PRISMA guidelines and can be used more effectively by other people. And it obviously takes a bit more time to do. And
this is a requirement if you want to get your work published. So,
yeah,
one of the methods we've had in terms of knowledge translation was being able to easily publish a lot of the work that we have done and build on each year as we would go through it. Now the expectation is that you've done a PRISMA evaluation for like in the upper extremity where there's 1,300 RCTs, motor recovery, the upper extremity, 1,300 RCTs. You're expected to have done a full PRISMA evaluation to come to that total. So it is more onerous. And that's one of the reasons we've had to pivot and shift to moving it to a 2-year cycle, simply because the expectations of the quality of reviews has gone quite much higher just in the last decade, and which is a real positive, right? It's a showing of maturity we're going from a time when I first started where nobody even knew how many randomized controlled trials there were and assumed there were 4 or 5, to now we have massive data sets which have extreme expectations on the quality of how that data set was gathered and analyzed. I think a lot of people now take that stuff for granted, but that's just over the last 2 decades we've seen that change.
I wonder, when I first got involved in clinical research, I remember there was this, I don't know if it was a statistic or data, it was based on anything, but that the lag time between bench and bedside in rehabilitation was 15 to 20 years. And the idea was that in oncology, you couldn't have that lag time because people die of cancer, whereas typically nobody dies of bad therapy. Do you think that the translation is still that long? What would you estimate or is it impossible to estimate? It depends on the therapist, kind of a deal.
It depends on the treatment, and it depends on the kind of support the treatment's got. A lot of it's cultural as well. But I would say that 15 to 20 years, from moving it from the research into regular clinical practice would be considered to be a very early adoption. That would be considered to be rapid. It's more than 15 to 20 years. In some cases, I think it's a couple generations. So it's fine to do, we're doing a lot of research and we do these really cool reviews and all that stuff. But, the whole idea of knowledge translation is a whole different kettle of fish and much, much harder. And the idea of being able to change clinical practice is really difficult.
Well, one of the great things about the EBRS are the bullet points that you can get to the clinical bottom line. And then if you want more information, you can sift through all the stuff that is below that. But the fact that you guys made the effort to make this stuff approachable and usable, maybe tomorrow in the clinic, I think was great. And it really helped my career because I did 700 talks in the last decade to clinicians. And I could go into the room, feel pretty comfortable, even though most of the people in the room had more education with regard to rehab than I did, but feel comfortable that what I was presenting to them wasn't just new to them, but was approachable because there's more money I owe you. It was just take these bullet points from the EBRSR and say, look at this stuff. This is great.
Well, it's funny though, when I designed it the group of us designed it back in 2001, we designed it in a specific way. And we just assumed that we were dealing with busy clinicians with low attention spans. All right. That was our assumption. And I think it was a reasonable assumption. And
that's pretty accurate.
I based it on my own self, right? Busy clinician with a low attention span. And so the key points, which are at the beginning of each chapter, were really designed to be for the person who only had 30 seconds. And that's all he was going to give you or she was going to give you. So the key points were for the 30-second person. And we figured that was probably 90% of our audience. And then we figured that another 7 or 8% might be ambitious and go back to the end and read the conclusions, which took 5 minutes to read, right? And then we figured there's probably 2 to 3% who actually read the content. But the thing is, for people to have some sense of trust and credibility in your key points, you had to do all the other stuff, right? It had to be there so that the occasional person who would go into it would be able to verify whether, in fact, they agreed or not. But it's interesting. My argument would be, and I think when we do our assessments of, page views and how long people spend on the site, probably most people just go straight to the key points. And they just want to know the answer. And they're not interested in all the nuances and all that. They just want to know, what does the evidence seem to suggest in 30 seconds or less.
I know last time we talked, and then you just mentioned it, that a lot of this is focused on the upper extremity. Is that because it takes up so much room in the brain? Is it because we figure if we can figure out finger extension, we can figure out just about anything? What are the things that are really making it? Is it because of animal models? Because we have great rats and mice that have very human-like movement of their hands? Is it all of those things? What is it with the upper extremity? What is it about the upper extremity that's so important?
Well, I could speculate, I think. My opinion would be that it really has to do more specifically almost with hand function. I think that is a big part of gaining independence in a lot of the activities of daily living, the things that you do, even when it comes to something like ambulation. If we can get them close, that might be good enough. We can get them up and moving or walking. They might still have some asymmetrical gait patterns, but whatever the case may be, they can use the ambulation that they have. But dexterity is super, super tricky. And it's one of the more complicated motor functions that we have, producing those very fine dexterous movements. It's very, we take it for granted really a lot of the time, but it's a very, very complicated issue, and one that really, really can affect a person's independence, their ability to go about their day without receiving help. So I think that is a big part of it. It's number one, how important it is to independence and recovery of function and in your functional goals. And then how difficult it is. It's really, really tough compared to some of the other stuff that is in motor rehabilitation.
Just to put it in a bit of perspective for the audience, there's as I mentioned before, well over 3,000 randomized controlled trials in stroke rehab, of which over 1,300 are just the upper extremity motor recovery alone. So that means that over 40% of all the randomized controls in stroke rehab involve the upper extremity from a motor standpoint, the interventions. And so it seems to be that it is the most dominant feature when it comes to stroke rehab research. And I think in part it's because hemiparesis is an iconic feature of stroke. I think it has to do with who does research. A lot more research is done, I think, by physiotherapists and to some extent occupational therapists than other therapy groups. I think it's easier to do and more interesting than, say, some of the more complex cognitive things that we have. Because, total, I think in the EBSR, we probably only have 400 to 500 trials that look at cognitive rehab. We got 1,300 that look at the upper extremity alone. So there's something about the upper extremity that is important, as Marcus has said, but I think is also easier and more interesting to study by a group that are, I think, fairly aggressive when it comes to research.
So you don't buy into the idea that it's all the rat choppers?
I wouldn't know how to interpret what you just said.
So we had Teresa A. Jones. She's a neuroscientist from UT Austin, and she does a lot of work in the forelimbs of rats and mice. And that the human-like paws, it's creepy. They look like little witch hands, and they even have the long, ugly fingers, and not quite the opposable thumb, but they really grasp and release very much like humans do. And I wonder if that has some of the impact on why we focus on, because we have this great analog in the upper extremity.
I'm going to give you an opinion, but I think that animal studies really help to move forward in terms of researchers who then apply those kind of things clinically to look at the neurophysiology of recovery in post-stroke in humans. I'm not sure that animal studies have the same degree of influence on randomized controlled trials.
Yeah, that's exactly what she said.
I think randomized controlled trials are often done because they're cool. We have almost 200 robotic randomized controlled trials in the upper extremity. That's just wild. That's almost as much as brain injury in total. It's incredible because robotics are cool. And what do people do? They buy a robotic machine and then they think we probably need to do a trial, right? So I think a lot of it is interest, right? What people are interested in, what's new, what can get funding, that kind of stuff. But I don't really know. If I was really being honest with you, I don't really know why the upper extremity is overrepresented when compared to aphasia, or compared to neglect, or compared to depression, or compared to the lower extremity, which is the next highest group. So I think we'd have to be honest and say we don't know, but it is an interesting observation we make. If you go into traumatic brain injury, you'll find very few randomized controlled trials, very few that look at the upper extremity. It's rare. To the point, the ratio is probably 40 to 50 to 1 in stroke versus brain injury. So there's something about stroke recovery and how patients recover and how we treat stroke patients that has really, I think, resulted in stroke being unique in this, looking at the upper extremity to the degree that they do. Then I can't say I fully understand. I think Marcus had a good answer. I don't know if it's the right one, but, it sounded good. And it sounds as good as anything I can think of. It makes sense, but in the end, I'd have to say I'm not quite sure. But it's a trend that's increasing, not decreasing, percentage-wise, which is really interesting.
Deb, I'll just keep asking questions until the sun goes down. So you better get in here.
I do have a question, and it might lead into what we have spoken of before. But I am curious to know, going back to the committee that got all of this started with the EBRSR, how did stroke rehab change in Ontario? Did it change in Ontario? What was the result? And
that'll lead us into, I think we need to go next. And Ontario, I think, has been exemplary and in the world in terms of stroke rehab, and I think has probably been the leader in Canada. There are other provinces that have done some parts of stroke rehab better, but I think overall Ontario has been the most organized. It's the largest province, so it's had the most resources. The thing that and I think it's just obviously it's not a Canadian thing. It's happening all over the developed world, is this idea, what I'm going to call standardization of care, which we had talked about earlier, which I think has just had a spectacular impact. I think, having been in this business for well over 30 years, longer than that actually, and watched how the changes have occurred, they really are amazing changes in what I would call the standardization of key principles in stroke rehab and the adoption of those throughout the Western world. And one of them is, and certainly this was a big push in Ontario, is the need for specialized stroke rehab services. The stroke unit studies that came out in the 1990s were pretty clear that, rehabbing patients on specialized stroke rehab units tended to result in better outcomes. The big three in terms of the content of the rehab had to do with getting patients into rehab earlier. So the earlier they came, the better they seemed to do. So there was that fit with the concepts around neuroplasticity being much more pronounced early on. Some of the animal work actually supported that. And that's one area where animal work probably had a big impact. The fact that the more intensive therapy the patients got, the better they seemed to do. So this emphasis on intensity, of which I think the Americans were probably the leaders with your 3-hour rule, as it was mandated by. In fact, that was how we model a lot of our Ontario and Canadian system. Our guidelines are based on that 3-hour rule. And everybody says, why'd you pick the 3-hour rule? Because in the UK, it's 2 hours and 15 minutes. I said, because the Americans did it and they had pretty good results. So that whole idea of intensity matters. And the idea of task-specific therapy. Because as you know, when we all started out, Bobath, and not the Bobath that's taught now, but the original Bobath, the neurodevelopmental type techniques were slower and seemed to be an indication in literature that when patients were treated with more task-specific therapy, that you seem to get results quicker. So the best way to learn to play tennis is to play tennis. The best way to learn how to get dressed is to practice dressing versus those repetitive activities that therapists used to do with the Bobath training. Bobath training worked, it just was slower, and that was the challenge. So the big three, I call it, the idea of task-specific therapy, intensive therapy, and getting patients in early became sort of increasingly bedrock principles that determined better outcomes and better rehab care. And in our country, and certainly in our province, it took us a while to get people to finally accept that. And I always joke that, we knew that we had finally accomplished what we needed to accomplish when the administrators all agreed that that's what needed to be done, right? Because once the administrators agree that this was good care and that we were able to actually then, I think, mold our system so it was focused more around those principles. Now, we still ourselves, as does most centers, struggle with the full operationalization of that, but I think there's widespread agreement that that's what constitutes good care. And then the final piece is the outpatient piece, which has taken longer to bring in, which, I think it's been well shown helps to solidify whatever patients learn in inpatient rehab when they go home. And so those 5 things are probably what I would call the 5 key areas of stroke rehab that have resulted in a really dramatic change in rehab over the last 15 to 20 years and have resulted in, I think, exemplary care compared to what we used to provide before, which was much more therapist dependent and was hit and miss depending on where you got your care. I think we've been able to standardize that both in your country and in our country. And I think as a result, the care is much better. It's the key to better stroke care right now. But unfortunately, it's interesting that, we've been able to accomplish this, and I think we've pretty much had it in place now for the last 5 to 8 years on a consistent basis across the country. But the big question I often hear people asking is, where do we go next?
Pete, we asked people to donate to our Venmo account to help us keep this podcast up and running. One of the things that I would like people to know about us is, if they don't already know it, is that we're pretty passionate about neuroscience and our practices and sharing this valuable information with the world. And personally, I hope people are enjoying it. I think they are, based on the number of downloads that we have, although I still don't understand what all of those numbers mean. And one of the things we would like to do going forward is bring people more value through our interactions with them, this podcast, and just making it easier for people to apply research-based concepts in their practices or their recoveries. So I think people might like to know that we're working on these things from the back end, and whether or not people donate, are able to donate, we appreciate them listening and sharing the podcast with others. What are your thoughts on that?
That's true. And we do have a Venmo account. Do you remember the address?
I do. It's @Neurons.
@Neurons.
That's pretty simple.
It is, and it's in our title. So if you want to help out, look, we do put a lot of work into this, and we want to keep it going. And, as Deb said, it's not the easiest thing in the world. Yes, we giggle a lot, and yes, we're having a ball doing it, but we could use your support. The other thing is that a certain percentage, 20%, is going to go to the
Brain Injury Association of America.
That's it. And they help folks who have had a brain injury, family caregivers, and they also help medical professionals who do research and treatment.
It sounds like a nice organization, and I'm glad that you told me about it.
Yep. We want to support all people that have had brain injury. And we can do it through the podcast, but we also do it through a 20% donation of what we make if you donate @Neurons.
Yeah. And we have goals for the future of this podcast. And one thing that we'd really like to do is be able to bring our listeners a little bit more. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is if we have some funding behind us.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
And I think that's part of what we're going to talk about today, eh? We've been able to really do well with this standardization of care, but we're now kind of struggling. Okay, is that it, or is there more that we should or could be doing to try and build upon that standardization of care to provide better outcomes for our patients?
I'm curious to know is there some sort of a standardized length of time that people stay on therapy in inpatient rehab? Is that more goal-driven, progress-driven?
It depends on the province. Our province has a rehab patient group system where when you're admitted based on certain elements of the FIM score, your age. So it's a very well-developed algorithm that's Ontario-based. You're allowed to say a certain amount of days. So if you're a very mild stroke, the expectation is you won't come to stroke rehab. If you're a severe younger stroke, you can stay 50 days. The average length of stay in Ontario, which is the most aggressive province in terms of moving patients out of the system, the average length of stay for your standard stroke patient is about 30 days, 30 to 35 days, which I think is a little longer than it is in the US.
I think it is too. And it seems like there's a big push to not admit people to inpatient rehab, the 3-hour facilities. And there's also a big push to discharge people before they're truly ready to be discharged here in the US.
Yeah, I've heard 17 days is quite common, and that would be considered pretty aggressive for Canada. I kind of describe that as rehab light. I have to say, I've always been impressed when I go down to the US on how aggressive people are in terms of treatment there, in terms of providing an intense environment, but it seems awfully short. It seems like you could accomplish more by keeping patients in longer.
I agree.
But I think
if anyone cares,
I think your system.
I care.
I think your system's a bit of an anomaly. I would say that the length of stays in Canada are pretty similar to what you see elsewhere. And even within our own country, there are quite significant differences among the provinces. And some of the provinces have length of stays that are longer, quite a bit longer. I'm not sure that that's a good use of resources, to be honest with you. I think that just because we in Ontario have a pretty strong algorithmic type system, and then the other provinces have just taken longer to adopt those types of things because they're smaller. But nevertheless, this is an interesting debate that we don't have much anymore, but we used to have a lot. Is what are the right lengths of stay and what are the best way to treat people? And I think we've come across something that we think is an appropriate length of stay, and I don't think there's a big push in Canada to try and shorten the length of stays to something that's more attuned to what you see in the US.
So when you talk about what's coming down the pike, I mean, for my money, I think you probably know more about stroke rehabilitation, stroke recovery than anybody else on the planet. I'm not blowing smoke. I just owe you money. That's all. So one of the things you talked about last time, and maybe we could go into a little bit of treatments that you see coming down the pike, looking into your crystal ball. You had talked about priming the brain, specifically using imagery, action observation. And I think the other one was mirror therapy. And then, of course, I went into the research frantically looking for articles about priming. It turns out there's quite a few, and I'm behind the curve. Can you use priming as sort of an entree into a crystal ball, looking into what's going to happen in the future in rehab? What would it look like in 20 years, do you think, or maybe 100 years?
Well, maybe I'll back up it a bit and get to the priming just a bit later, because I want to set the table for it by just getting people to understand the literature. By the way, I think there are many people out there who know more about stroke rehab than I do, but I certainly have a good feel for it from an overall general standpoint.
Right.
I think that's the one advantage. There are people who I greatly admire who I think do know a lot more than I do, but we won't go there.
Maybe we should, because we need more guests.
I can do that afterwards. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't want to embarrass them in front of the group.
There you go.
But I certainly have worked and continue to work with some people that are just absolutely superb. Some nice up and coming people as well, who I think are going to help to mold the field. I'm going to use Marcus and I will talk a bit about the upper extremity, because that's where we've spent most of our time. And that's where I think we are kind of getting a glimpse as to what we think the future might look like. And I'm not the only person that's talked this way in the past, but I think I'm the only person that's talked about it with the kind of data that we've had available to us. So if you remember, there are 1,307 randomized controlled trials for the upper extremity up until April of 2021, which means there's probably 1,400 now. Well, maybe not quite that much, but getting up there. And of those, they some of them look at two different interventions, right? So there's probably, I think we calculated there was 1,906 different studies of a specific intervention. So we have 1,907, I don't know how you word it, episodes where an intervention was studied other than conventional care. So that's a lot of data. It's a lot of data. And when you break the data down and look at it carefully, about 15% of those studies that look at the upper extremity, which we're going to use as our example, but the data seems to hold true when you go right across the board, are for things that we talked about with regard to standardized care, looking at things like intensity, specifically looking at task-specific therapy, looking specifically at getting patients in early, yada, yada, yada. The other 85% are things we call adjunct therapies, which are outside of those. I think Julie Bernhardt calls them behavioral therapies, those primary behavioral therapies that are utilized as part of standardized care, that sort of one-on-one therapist walking the patient, getting them to move their arm, the stuff that goes on in rehab all the time and is really the blood and guts of rehab. The thing that makes it go is that one-on-one therapist relationship with the patient in terms of getting them to move their arm and try to do various tasks with their arm. Interestingly, as I mentioned before, that accounts for only about 15% of the research if you count the research based on the number of randomized controlled trials. The other 85% of the trials are what we mentioned before, the adjunct therapies, which are kind of those additional things you can do. Like you talked about mirror therapy, like RTMS, like robotics, like action observation training, like functional electrical stimulation. That stuff accounts for the vast majority of the research that's currently being conducted in the upper extremity, right? And interestingly, and this is why bringing it up, in most centers, those adjunct therapies are rarely used, even though they account for 85% of the research. We're just doing a big national survey looking at this across Canada. And, the data that's coming back kind of confirms that people are not really utilizing these additional therapies on a consistent basis. And some of the reasons for it are quite concerning, because some people will say, well, things like constraint-induced movement therapy or mirror therapy is outside my scope of practice, right? Which is kind of like, yeah, we got some work to do, right? So, we've got all these therapies out there. Most of the randomized controlled trials are positive. There's got huge numbers of them. And it's an impressive database that's beginning to support all these adjunct therapies. And many of them have been shown to improve recovery or improve recovery versus conventional treatment. And yet we're not utilizing these treatments on anything close to a consistent basis. So if you were to ask me, where is there an opportunity to see if we can improve our outcomes above standardized care, I'd say it's the introduction of these adjunct therapies. And so I think that's really, going to be critical to the future. And, when we sit down with our therapists and ask them, do you use the adjunct therapies? The answer is usually not a lot. And why? Well, there's a number of reasons, timing, but it's just like, it's not part of the culture. Like, it's just not part of the culture, and you ask them, would you like to do it? And of course we would. I mean, why wouldn't we? Right? I wouldn't mind trying something new or trying this new technology or this new treatment, but I don't know where to start. It's not what we've traditionally done. It's not what we tend to do. I'm busy enough as it is. And so these treatments don't get incorporated or added. So, the reasons are legit and they're fine. But I mean, if we're looking at ways that we might be able to further improve recovery and the next big step, because, one of the things that you get a feeling in stroke rehab is people just not quite sure where we're going to go next. It strikes me that this is a lost opportunity that we could take advantage of. And so, before I go any further, Marcus, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think you covered most of it. I mean, like Bob said, there's just, I think 50 some interventions that we have with good evidence, 5, 10, 20 RCTs, some of these interventions, and positive evidence, mind you, that supports their use, and they're just not being used. So it is a missed opportunity.
You say 50?
Well, in the entire chapter, we have over 50. We've identified over 50 interventions. I think here 47 have 5 or more RCTs. We have 37 with 10 or more, and there are 22 with over 20 RCTs. And
there's actually, I think there's 5 of them with more than 100 RCTs.
Yeah.
I mean, the data is quite substantive. And so we were thinking about this one and trying to figure out ways that we could try to encourage or frame this so that therapists and others would be more likely to utilize these treatments. And we came up with the idea And I have to admit, I'm not the first person to come up with the idea, but we came up with the idea within the EBSR that we could divide the treatments into two types, the adjunct treatments. Those that prime the brain, and I think that's what you were talking about, actually three types. Those that prime the brain, and we were interested in those, and those that sort of facilitate things more peripherally. And then the third group were those that treat complications like pain or spasticity, which we were sort of set aside. I mean, those are treatments that are used probably more often because they often have a pharmaceutical company that's promoting them, right? And so they actually have been integrated quite quickly into stroke rehab care, particularly botulinum toxin, because it's got a big brother who's moving stuff along, right? Who's been able to really facilitate that movement.
Hey everybody, I wanted to talk to you about something that's really important. Recovery from brain injury. Since 2016, I've been doing consultations with stroke survivors and survivors of other forms of acquired brain injury. I get together with them on Zoom for about 45 minutes to an hour, and we have a good long chat about how their recovery is going, where they are in the process, what their ambitions are for their recovery, and what's holding them back. Often a caregiver is also in the meeting, and sometimes clinicians show up. Anyway, we end up talking about anything under the sun that's involved with their recovery. And then I take a few days, do the pertinent research, and email them back a sort of recovery manual dedicated to their specific recovery. Often it's stuff that comes straight out of neuroscience and neuropsychology and emerging technologies. I email that manual back to their survivor, and every one of the suggestions in the email has clickable links to more information. I'm going to be putting a link on the show notes, but probably the best way to find out how to set it up is to email me at my personal email. And that's StrongerAfterStroke, 3 words, all stuck together, no spaces, StrongerAfterStroke@yahoo.com. You don't have to email me anything. In fact, all you have to do is write consultation in the subject line, and I'll email you back with how to set it up. It's that simple. StrongerAfterStroke@yahoo.com. So let's get together and jack your recovery up. That's right.
And so, one of the things we thought of is we would start looking at things like primers and facilitators. So primers can be things that are fairly expensive and fairly high tech. So they can be items like RTMS or direct electrical current, or they can be simple things like mirror therapy or bilateral arm training or action observation or mental practice. I mean, I gave a talk on this to the Malaysian rehab group about 8 months ago now. And one of the questions was, well, what if I can't afford an RTMS? Because, in Malaysia, there's some of the best rehab hospitals you'll run into anywhere in the world. And then there's other hospitals out in the rural areas that are really quite limited. And I said, you could get a mirror, they're cheap. You can practice
and easy to make.
So, if you can't do, you can do virtual reality fairly easily nowadays with gaming and all that sort of stuff. And so, there was the idea of brain stimulating therapies that they could be these expensive things like RTMS and like I said, transcranial direct current stimulation or theta burst stimulation or even EMG biofeedback, or they can be really simple things like mirror therapy and bilateral arm treatment, mental practice. All of them, though, do help to prime the brain. And so they seem to provide additional prompting of the brain so that when you do your standardized therapy, patient tends to respond better. That's the thinking, and that was what we promoted. So, we kind of said on the one hand, you can look at priming the brain. On the other hand, we argued that, you could look at perhaps facilitating treatments. These are things that are more, I would call specific exercise therapies that work more peripherally. So they might be things like strength training, trunk training, even constraint-induced movement therapy, although you could argue that might have a cognitive component. Or they could be things like sensory stimulation, acupuncture, TENS machines, muscle vibration, thermal stimulation, or they could be some of the new technologies like robotics or neuromuscular electrical stim, functional electrical stim, etc. And those tend to work more peripherally. One of our challenges right now in rehab is we have a lot of evidence, and we'll talk a bit later about network meta-analyses and being able to pinpoint where that evidence might work best. But one of our challenges with adjunct therapies is we have a lot of research evidence, but we don't necessarily have a lot of clinical experience. And I really think that clinical experience is going to be really critical to their adoption and trying to figure out where those therapies work best and on who they work best. I'll give you an example. Exoskeleton, the exoskeleton robotics doesn't work on mild stroke patients. It works on severe stroke patients. That's who you use it on. That's who's most likely going to benefit. That's just a simple example of where, clinical experience begins to give you that knowledge base to allow you to decide how to apply these treatments. And also in the future, develop some new research protocols to look at specific groups who might benefit from these treatments. So we would argue, and we have been arguing, and we just got an article now making this sort of pitch to as a commentary in the archives of PhysMed Rehabs that we're hoping to get published, which is now under submission. And it argues that, perhaps then we should be encouraging, and certainly we have at our center, encouraging our therapists to maybe try one primer and one facilitator. Just in that patient, which primer do you think might work and what facilitator might work? And, pick it based on what you think the treatment's going to do and based on what patient you've got in front of you and whether they would benefit or not. And try and develop that expertise in these treatments and see if we don't start getting better outcomes. Because the studies would suggest that adding these treatments to our current standardized treatment has the potential to further improve those motor recovery outcomes, which is interesting. And, you asked me, where do I think it's going to go down the road? Rehab, I think it's going to be the use of these adjunct therapies. It's going to become more and more prominent as a way of trying to further improve clinical recovery.
One of the things Pete and I talk about a lot on the podcast, establishing a home program or a home exercise program from the beginning of therapy so that you can try it with your patient and then give them the materials that they need, the instructions that they need to use that when they're not in therapy. And then that way you have time with them to talk to them, to see if they understand what they're doing, to see if it's actually doing the priming, if it's making a difference. And then you're setting them up for more success when they go home, which seems to be important here in the US, especially because they're cutting back on the number of treatment days that they will allow a person to remain inpatient rehab.
Yeah, but when you think about home therapy to some extent, the way you're describing it, it's still that intensity issue, right? It's that repetition, doing the same thing over and over again that I think is so critical to rehab. No one's going to argue. And, when they go home, we find they tend to do better in some ways because it's more task specific, right? And they're more into it. But
I feel like you're setting them up for success, though. When if you get them started doing it when they're with you, you can give them that feedback. You can help make sure that they understand what they're supposed to do, and then create a true home program for them for when they leave.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's kind of how I think about it.
And some of the, and just to speak to, the importance of continuity of care when they go home, if you look at the the early supported discharge literature that was published, meta-analysis was published back in 2012, they very carefully looked at who benefited from early supported discharge. And interestingly, early supported discharge, as you know, is when patients are discharged early, but they're still given a similar degree of rehab therapy out in the community. They just don't get the nursing. All right. And the Brits were really big on that, as you know, for quite some time. And it's become are still the real leaders in that area. But what they were able to demonstrate was that, if the same therapist treated the patient in the hospital and then treated them at home, that same therapist, they got much better results than if they did a handoff to another therapist, right? And if there was no handoff, just a written note, they actually did a little worse. And so overall, early supported discharge came back positive because the specific studies that looked at that therapist continuity throughout had such positive results that it carried the whole rest of them. All right. And it speaks to the importance of continuity of care. It's a really cool idea that showed up in that study, and I think is something we all intuitively know but don't practice practice very well. We do have a lot of outpatient therapy in our center, and we do a lot of the rehab in the patient's home. We have a special program for that does the full rehab in the patient's home, or they come to the hospital, one or the other. And we've been working on this idea of a warm handoff to try and incorporate, because I think it's too much of a paradigm shift for us to have the same therapist managing patients in the hospital and in the community. And that's just too much for us to get our heads around. We're not there yet, but we do this thing called a warm handoff where, the therapist that's going to be managing in the community may come in for a day and study how they're doing near the end of their stay, and can just easily then pick up from what was going on in the in-house piece when they go back into the community. That kind of got me wandering off in another direction, but I think it's an important point that we often miss, another opportunity to make things better by making sure that we're careful with regard to continuity of care. And I think we're a little sloppy on that one. When people leave the hospital, people kind of assume, okay, I wrote my discharge summary and that's it, right? And then the next one picks them up, reads the discharge summary, and then, patients complain. They do the assessment all over again.
Yes.
And they even treat me differently than what's worked before. So, that's just that's a little off topic a bit, but I think an interesting observation.
No, it's not off topic at all. And in fact, our listenership, a lot of them are OTs. We think there's a lot of folks that have had brain injury. There's a lot of caregivers. There's some PTs as well. And, nothing warms the cockles of the heart of a therapist than to know that they're missed. And so they work on these they have more contact time with them than with the patient than anybody else practically. And now they've made this emotional connection, and that helps drive recovery. It makes sense that if you provide that bridge, it's going to help things. And I think any therapist listening to this might start to think about how can we do what you call it, a warm handoff. And
other centers do it. It's not unique. I've heard it done in many other places, because I think people recognize the importance of that continuity as a way to, provide better care, and it doesn't cost more money.
Right.
It's just a different model. It's certainly much more patient-centered. Sometimes we forget that, a lot of the care we provide is provider-driven and not necessarily patient-driven. So, that's a good example of where it's much more patient-driven.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We appreciate your support and would love to hear from you. Ask us questions and share your thoughts by email at NogginsAndNeurons@gmail.com. That's Noggins, the word and spelled out, neurons @gmail.com. If you like what you heard, please share this podcast with others you think will benefit. Also, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. We'll catch you next time on Noggins and Neurons, Stroke and TBI Recovery Simplified.